So does everybody remember the questions? Thanks, Arlene. I had to like pull up the slide from the deck that they sent us earlier, Amandeep. But we're talking about change. What change do you think your organization will have to make in the next 2 to 5 years, and or will want to make in the next 2 to 5 years? And also, full disclosure, Amandeep and I are not allowed to do the report out when we go back. So please be thinking about whether you might be willing to share some major takeaways with the full group. Would anybody like to start, or I'll be happy to just randomly close my eyes and point. Yes, thank you, Arlene, for typing that in. Bruno.
Okay, I'll start, but I'm sure that my organization, the International Association of Mathematical Physics, is a bit different than most, if not all of the others presented here. It has existed for a long time. It's an international association of individual members. It's not very large. It's dedicated to a broad range of topics that are covered, and they're called usually mathematical physics. But what is probably different is that it's entirely run by volunteers. And this has made it possible to keep costs down, to really focus on what people find most important. There is an executive committee that is directly elected, and as well as a couple of officers that run the organization. But it's 100% volunteers who until now had also more or less managed with just some volunteer assistance of people at their institutions to handle the technology, the database and membership and the newsletter and all kinds of things. And I'm starting to wonder for how long we can sustain this. And so we are probably very late to this, but it's going to be time if we want to proceed and do really valuable virtual experiences for our members. We will have to upgrade it here and there a little bit. And so I'm still hoping that it can proceed as a volunteer organizations, but we can maybe just contract with companies that can provide the services that we need without having the need of an organization with permanent staff itself, because that would change our financial structure entirely. And people would be very reluctant to give that up. So I don't know whether anyone can comment on that. And I know that this is very different for the big organizations in the room, and probably the ones that thought they were small. They don't realize there are even smaller ones out there. Okay, so that's, yes, we need to change, and but probably these changes are ones that you all have made a long time ago.
So I can make comments that are somewhat related. So we're also a more or less all volunteer society. We rely on volunteers for meeting organization, for web services, everything. As the world gets more complicated, that's becoming more challenging, and so we're going to need to be making similar changes. One issue that I'm a little bit concerned about for our organization is the trends in membership. Our organization is a mix of academics and government labs and industrial members, and we've seen declines, particularly in the number of industrial members. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is how we broaden the appeal of our meetings, which are primarily focused on academics, to better support industrial members of the society, and just more broadly, how do we use the resources that we have and the activities that we have to kind of maintain the energy of the organization. So those are things that we're thinking about. I think one advantage that maybe we have is that we're reasonably well off financially. And so the question is, what's the best way to use money that we do have for activities to really increase the vitality, especially of our meetings, but all of our society activities. And this crisis is an opportunity to do these experiments in broadening the formats of our meetings. So we have one coming this fall, and we're thinking now about we're not going to run a full hybrid meeting. And I liked Kevin Marvel's comment earlier on focusing on providing the most valuable content in a hybrid or streaming fashion rather than trying to do the whole thing. And that's what we're going to do. We're certainly going to stream our plenaries and a few other things probably. And we kind of have to decide what to include and what to exclude there, because we're going to run a live meeting, but we have lots of participation from Europe traditionally, a little bit from Asia. They're not going to be able to attend. So those are things that we're going to have to deal with over the shorter term. Longer term, I do think the membership issue is a big thing for us.
And I like how you're saying experiment, because it is just experimental and we're going to only be able to get feedback by trying things. James has had his hand up and you can go ahead.
Yeah, hey, Jim Dobbins with AAPM. I'm president of AAPM this year. I don't have a lot to say I shared this a little bit in the previous breakout session. For us, we have a relatively large organization, about 9,000 members. Our largest annual meeting is about, I think, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 members in attendance. And that's been a key focal point for us for our activities each year. Has been our annual meeting. We also have several other smaller meetings during the year. So the annual meeting has obviously always historically been in person only. This year it was 100% virtual, and it was last year 100% virtual as well because of the pandemic. So I think we're trying to figure out going forward in terms of meetings, just how we incorporate the upsides from having asynchronous content, open a bigger tent where we can have people maybe internationally or in the US that couldn't attend because of finances or schedule, to basically expand to the range of people that can attend our meetings without decimating too much of the in-person content. So I think for us, the challenge is going to be getting that balance right. If we have too much of it that's online, then that's going to decimate probably our in-person attendance, which would be bad both financially for the meeting, because it's one of our three main sources of revenue for the association, but also just in terms of the experience of getting together and having networking, especially for our younger members. It's a key point of that for them. So we don't want to decimate our in-person experience. So we have to somehow build value for that in a way that is going to encourage people to still continue to come and do that, but just expand the tent bigger for people who couldn't otherwise attend. I'm not sure we'll get that balance right, at least at first. It'll probably take some iterating. But there are some things in order to allow people to do asynchronous viewing of sessions, to be able to go back to sessions and review them again over the course of the coming months. There are a lot of things that the virtual content has provided for us that we would like to capture and carry forward. Just broadly, in terms of the association, one of the things for us in our particular field is just thinking about the future of science in our area. That's not an urgent crisis, but over the course of the next 20 years, it's likely to change. So we're trying to figure that out. That's a bigger question than the meetings, and we're focusing just on meetings here. But that's sort of a big question for us, sort of an existential question going forward. How do we adapt to changes in science? So that's all I have to share.
Thanks for sharing that, Jim. Other feedback, Diane?
Yeah, think that the Acoustical Society is about the same size as Jim's. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name of your society, AAPM. And had similar experiences about having to become all virtual very suddenly and so forth. What worries me is that we're desperately hoping to have an in-person meeting coming in December. And we're already lined up for an in-person in Denver in it's May or June of next year. And I'm worried that the traditions of our society over 90 years old say, oh yeah, well, in person is better, and we're just going to go back to doing it the same old way. And there are clearly many things that have been talked about both in the paper and in the sessions I've been in that are such advantages to keeping some virtual component, particularly accessibility, around the world and to populations who cannot make it to meetings is very important, I think, to us, etc. And I think trying to get a society that really isn't that big and doesn't have that big a staff, not to be overwhelmed by saying, hey, wait a minute, we've got to keep the really positive parts of the virtual as we hopefully, at least the December meeting has an in-person component to it, although, you never know. But I feel this resistance to, or an impetus to say, oh, good, it's in person, we know how to do that. Well, we probably do, but that doesn't mean we should do it like that anymore. We should take what we've learned, the best of the best, extend what we're hearing now as new technologies can even improve things. So that was a lot, sorry.
No worries, thank you. I know in my experience, my advisor, my PhD advisor, has a lot of pushback from the different conferences she's a part of to do any hybrid type of thing. It's just super controversial. So Hunter, you can go ahead. You are muted. Okay.
Yeah, I got it. Sorry. There are a lot of things that we're looking at, and I think one of the biggest things that we're going to have to do over the next 2 to 5 years, a couple of things, but obviously, how do we find and I think it's going to be experimental as we go, but what is the right balance, as you said, Diane, between a virtual and in-person meeting, and how do you make that work? And I think there will be some things that we are going to that we have been doing in person that will now be totally virtual. I think that's going to happen as well. And the other thing that I think the biggest initiative that I think we need to work on over the next 2 to 5 years to really help the field of physics is we really have to make sure, as we're doing our meetings, that we make them inclusive. And invite young physicists in the marginalized areas into the APS and really work with them to get them engaged and really part of the culture of APS. So I think that's really one of our biggest things that we need to work on in our meetings.
Early career, yes, that is always maybe perhaps overlooked often, but really those are the people that are going to be taking over. I know personally, I'm already looking at other grad students that could start doing what I'm doing, as I should be finishing soon. Go ahead, Kalman.
Hello, Kalman Migler from Society of Urology. I think my camera has stopped working. So one point that I had heard in one of the other breakout sessions that I thought was potentially very interesting to the Society of Urology, which I'm secretary, is this idea of recording and assigning DOIs to to things like plenaries and invited lectures. And because in the Society of Urology, in any case, we run the premier journal in our field, and essentially, half this is, the society is composed of the journal and our annual meetings. And so if we can blend those two a little bit, so traditionally they're quite distinct, but if we can have a way to bring some of those invited lectures into the journal, for example, you are, diversifying who can see it, and you're really bringing two what have been two disparate components of the society together. And so there certainly could be experimentation that we can do on that front.
Thank you for sharing that, Coleman. Yes, we definitely thought that that could also help with the intellectual property concerns that that are going to come up as we start sharing conference material, maybe more broadly. Anyone else want to share thoughts what your societies will have to change in the next 2 to 5 years, want to change, or some guideposts that will help your meeting organizers as they experiment and try new things? So what are some non-negotiable things that we need to make sure that the meetings hold on to?
I think, Hunter, you have your hand raised, or is that from before?
I do. And I just wanted to say one of the other things that
Thanks.
we're looking at and working on is we are getting, and I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, but a very large collection of recordings on all of these subjects that we need to really look at putting into a content repository. So I think making that all of that physics accessible, and how we're going to do it. Do we monetize it? What do we do with it? So that's another, what are we going to do with all this rich content? Where is it going to be? How are we going to make it accessible to everyone? So that's the next step of part of this as well.
And I really liked how Brian mentioned, Brian from the panel mentioned that this recorded content could be akin to how we take in social media or news. Like in the morning when I wake up, I love being able to listen to something, podcasts, videos, as I'm doing other work. So if it could be a physics lecture or a related field, I would love that. Outside of these very podcast things that don't really have this peer review process that we see in our scientific conferences. So I would really like to see this content being made widely available, and I think there is an audience for it.
I was just going to respond to what Hunter said, if I could. So this is Jim Dobbins at AAPM. So we have a fairly large virtual library of content from previous meetings. Now, for us, since we're in the medical arena, maintenance of certification is an issue for many of our members. So they have to actually accrue continuing education credits, as do every discipline in medicine. And so we have figured out how to monetize the selling of access to quizzes that accompany some of that material, Hunter, that we have in the virtual library. We've also recently adopted a new model for how we would charge for access to this ahead of time. Typically, our members get access to the virtual library, but not to the quizzes without paying. Now we're going to provide access where members can attend a meeting and get access to our virtual library right away. Or if they don't register for the meeting, we allow them to come back in later at a somewhat reduced price and purchase retrospectively access to the virtual library. And then after some embargo time, then it goes and is available to the general public. But Angela Kaiser, our executive director, can provide more detailed comments than I could on sort of the monetizing strategy for us in the medical arena.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it'd be great to know what providers you all are using to hold that content, because we definitely in the ASA have some videos, but it resides on my Dropbox right now.
Right. Angela Kaiser could put you in contact with the folks within the staff within AAPM that could help you with those details.
Thanks.
And I will say that just so you know, that Lauren Kane with Moressier, who's a part of the group that is putting on this session. Lauren, her company is one of the ones that does do that, just so you're aware. A good company. So
we probably have time for one more person if anybody wants to share out. Also, it would be great if somebody would volunteer to do the report out, since we're getting close to the 20-minute mark. Anybody want to volunteer to do that? Remember, the report out is just to share like some big takeaways that you got from this conversation.
I appreciated Diane's comments. I don't want to volunteer you, Diane, but I thought that you summarized them well.
Diane, you willing to be our reporter?
Oh, geez. Okay, I'll try, but you just one or two, right? I'm not supposed to do the.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Other thoughts? Guideposts that can help you as you work with your organizing your future scientific meetings that are still just there while you experiment around them.
I don't have a comment. I just want to reiterate what I heard, which was that there's this tension between, as we go back into the normal world, how much online and how much in person happens at our meetings. And so that's a concern. There's concern about membership issues and integrating industry people and how to monetize the content that we've gathered in our online virtual conferences. And I already said this, but what's the right balance between virtual and in person? And what else did I hear? And needing the right tool, so the repository to contain all of this content. And changing the culture of our organizations around conferences and whether we continue with the same culture that we've already had or we expand it for bigger groups.
Sounds good.
And yeah,
I just wanted to, if I could quickly chime in, I think, Amandeep, your note about making content available later and thinking of it in the types of, like the podcast format, so people have something to listen to in the way that we listen to podcasts. I think that's really smart. I'm with the media services team at AIP, and we're always considering the podcast angle and what the future of that would be. And I think repurposing content from meetings in that way just makes it much more accessible. And if you think about how it's composed and delivered, you might be able to reach a really broad audience, which is, of course, a great suggestion. I think that would be a nice takeaway as well.
Yeah, and adding on the integration of the sessions with journal entries.
I think yes, because that incentivizes people to present. Any smaller conference I go to normally has that, where it becomes a published work then, and I can add it to my CV. And as a grad student, that is very valuable to me. And I didn't really recognize that before. So that is very important, adding this journal aspect. And honestly, yes, podcasts, I wasn't really a believer. I'm I guess a later millennial, but I started listening to podcasts recently. Love it. If physics could do that, that would be awesome.
Miranda.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I just wanted to echo what Amanda said and what Jim said. We have these repositories in AAPM. I listen to them routinely, so it's fantastic, and I'm glad people would use it. I'm a big fan of the repositories.
Well, thank you all so much for joining in our room and discussion. Thank you, Diane, for being willing to report out when we go back to the main room. And you're welcome to push the blue button now if you wish.